Hey fellas, it's your good pal Tomthechosen1, and I'm back again with another video, but this time around, unlike my last video, we actually got something positive to talk about. But somehow there's a little bit of sadness in it all the same. But hey, let's forget about that for now. The game, of course, that we're going to be talking about is Alone in the Dark, developed by Pieces Interactive, which, if you're not aware, is a remake of the ye old Alone in the Dark that came out all the way back in 1992, developed by Infogrames, and is considered one of the first survival horror games ever made. So, you know what that means, fellas? It means we need to talk some history. Alone in the Dark is an interesting series, not only for its very up or down nature on the quality of the games, running the gambit from the original 1992 release to 2015's Alone in the Dark Illumination, which was kind of bafflingly bad because it was an only online multiplayer game and it was just bad. But more importantly, it's interesting because arguably Alone in the Dark is the primogenitor of the survival horror genre to begin with. It's wild to think all the way back in 1992 that Infogrames came up with the concepts such as fixed camera angles, a focus on exploration and puzzle solving, and eventually, after unlocking the first two floors of Derceto Manor, a less linear approach to the game that had you looking for items in certain areas to complete puzzles in another area. And hey, there's also a cast of enemies that can be destroyed using either your hands or feet, or even a selection of weapons with limited amounts of ammunition. And when you combine all these aspects together into a blender, you pretty much get what we have today, known as the classic survival horror game. So you take games like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, or hell, even leading up all the way to 2022's wonderful Signalis, and they all come back to the DNA of Alone in the Dark. But sadly, this series has sort of been ran into the ground. After about 5 good games to the franchise, it kind of went to hell with the likes of releases such as Illumination, that was an online-only PvE mess, and then there's whatever the hell is going on with Alone in the Dark 2008, though I gotta admit, it's got some incredible lines in it.
Now give me my stone!
I don't have your stone, and fuck you anyway.
So when I heard that Pieces Interactive out of Sweden was going to pick up the pieces of the Sordid series, no pun intended, and create from the ground up a remake of Alone in the Dark in that old American Gothic setting of 1930s Louisiana with the same OG characters, well, I was a little hesitant. From my, and honestly most people's perspectives, it seemed like Embracer was strapped for cash and looked at the IP that they own and thought, hey, maybe I can make a quick buck out of this, and it doesn't really help that they added in David Arbor and Jodie Comer as Edward Carnby and Emily Hartwood respectively, which seems like a strange appeal to the popular masses out there, using actors from popular shows to get people interested. But myself not being one to shy away from survival horror games, I thought to myself, well, you know what, hey, to hell with it. I'm gonna play this video game and I'm gonna see what it comes up with. And honestly, fellas, I was kind of really damn surprised. So, let's talk about it. Alone in the Dark stars our two protagonists, Edward Carnby, a drunkard private detective from Louisiana, escorting our other protagonist, which is Emily Hartwood, to Derceto Manor to find the whereabouts of her uncle Jeremy Hartwood, who sent a rather concerning letter to Emily warning her not to come to Derceto, lest some nasty evil gets the best of her. From here on out, you will be given the choice whether to play the weathered Detective Carnby or be the bearer of the Hartwood curse in Emily and figure out just what in the goddamn is happening in Derceto. From there, the game basically controls like you would think most standard survival horror games do these days. So think the likes of Resident Evil or Dead Space for the gameplay style that Alone in the Dark is trying to convey, and though it doesn't have the same finesse that the other two games have. Gameplay-wise, like most survival horror games, you'll have your time split between walking the halls of Derceto Manor, finding items, solving puzzles, and moving the plot along to see what's going on, while on the other half of the game, it will be spent fighting goopy-ass monsters. Exploration-wise, Alone in the Dark does things relatively well for the scope of the game, and it takes a lot from Resident Evil 2's remake in that you're basically playing through the game mostly the same way with the two characters, though with some minor changes usually when it comes to the narrative. The other half of the game will take us to other locales and mysterious, corrupted otherworlds where the vast majority of the enemies and horror elements can be found. And we really do have some goopy looking enemies. They're frankly disgusting. But to get combat out of the way quickly, I really do want to stress that Alone in the Dark is not a AAA game, and that it is going to have some quirks and stiffness that can be found in most AA games of the genre. While I can say that for the most part the combat is nice and responsive when it really matters, like aiming and shooting, which is responsive enough to do what you need to do without feeling frustrated, and more surprisingly the dodging actually worked really well. While I wouldn't say it's as tight as dodging enemies in Resident Evil 4, like whenever they tried to swing a board at you but then you dodged out of the way, but it was good enough in Alone in the Dark that it genuinely surprised me and left me satisfied. And I do gotta say that on top of that, there will also be a few sections where you might grab a certain mobster's weapon and lay waste to all the goopy enemies that tried to ruin your day. And while it's not the biggest thing, it definitely left me with a smile on my face, reciting, "I believe ya, but my Tommy gun don't." Now get down on your knees and tell me you love me. Or, in this case, tell me how much you love solving puzzles because, well, that's next. Wandering around Derceto, you might be grabbing someone's left behind notes that have to deal with hidden details in a portrait of writers, or esoteric numbers that correspond to notches on a mysterious talisman that might lead you to some strange places. A lot of the puzzles in Alone in the Dark, like they are in most survival horror games, are very environmentally driven, so you might be scrounging up some medicine bottles so you can match the pattern of rot or mold that can tell you a thing or two about your surroundings, and then use that to compare with the talisman and do some other things and then move with the plot. Some of the other ones are more simple, like finding some bolt cutters so you can cut off a lock on a door or otherwise get into areas that you might not have been able to beforehand. And fellas, I'm just gonna do a quick aside, but talking about bolt cutters, but it feels like they're in every single survival horror game these days. It might just be Resident Evil and how much those games permeate my thoughts, but I feel like I've seen the visual of selecting a padlock and then watching bolt cutters in detail cut through them to get through a door, but hey, anyway. These puzzles, like they are in Resident Evil, are not difficult at all, so if you're worried that you're going to be stumped in an area for a long ass time, then don't worry about it because most of the puzzles are relatively simple in my opinion. Frankly, I do like puzzles with a bit more meat on them so you can get your noggin jogging, but I'm also the kind of guy that eats Moon Logic adventure games for lunch, so I might be on a different level, no offense. Only real issues that I came across with in this regard aren't really gameplay specific issues, but more kind of design issues that became a little bit of annoying. For instance, the collision for this game is a bit stiff, and there's some areas that you think you would be able to just drop down, but it'll be sort of like an invisible wall in the way, or you might be stuck in the environment that, while a little bit frustrating, you're not going to typically be stuck for very long. So another issue that I dealt with are kind of loading issues. So what I mean is that when you start the game from a fresh boot, the game when it starts to load your save, you might have to sit around for a sec for all the environments and sounds to load in as well. Though I'm gonna have to admit that Alone in the Dark was installed in one of my HDDs instead of the typical NVMe drive that I typically install all my new games into, so that might have a lot to do with it. So with the gameplay out of the way, I think it's about time that we start talking about the presentation of Alone in the Dark, and while it's nothing crazy, it certainly gets the job done. This might be a bit difficult for me to describe, but Alone in the Dark sits in a spot that I am completely satisfied when it comes to the technical and visual fidelity at a AA level, with quote-unquote, let's say, new games. It's just one of those games that visually it just works and portrays everything that it needs to in what some would describe a no-frills manner. But let's be honest fellas in saying that this is a AA game with a limited budget from a relatively small Swedish studios. For what Pieces Interactive has done, I think they've really done a great job. The environments are particularly enjoyed, what with wandering old rotting Derceto with the ever-encroaching Louisiana swamp not too far off in the distance, providing what I can only imagine are some very interesting, stanky smells. There are some other locations that I don't really want to spoil that change things up a little bit that really highlight what kind of setting this game is supposed to be in, especially in one such area that has an all-swallowing darkness to it that you need to use a flare gun to get through properly. Though I think the area that catches people the most off guard are the fact that our two protagonists are portrayed and scanned in from real actors like David Arbor and Jodie Comer, which when then compared to the rest of the cast that are obviously not scanned in, it kind of creates this sort of disconnect, but I don't really have an issue with it. In a weird way, and I'll kind of elaborate this more in the narrative section of the video, but having Carnby and Emily be real actors and the rest of the cast as not scanned actors creates a sort of division between the world that Derceto inhabits and the world that Carnby and Emily come from, which is sort of a proxy for the player because once we get into that house, well, everything's going to become nuts and it's going to change. As for the performances, I think everybody did a decent enough job, though at first I thought that Arbor and Comer came off as pretty stiff in their roles, but the more and more that they get into the thick of things in Derceto, the more they bring their chops out. On the other hand, all the other characters are very stereotypical and almost cartoonish that for some might come across as overacting these sorts of American Gothic characters, but with the sort of pulpy feel that I think the game was going for, I think it's just fine and dandy. But like I said previously, I'll elaborate on how I feel on that here pretty soon. But to cap out this section, I'll likely touch on the soundtrack of Alone in the Dark, and it's mostly your typical horror strings and whatnot when it's a spooky moment. But for the rest, there's this little bit of southern jazz that really cements into what sort of era we're supposed to be in, and that is of course 1930s Louisiana. There's even a whole jazz club that you'll come across in the game with the drunkard nymphomaniac flapper trying to flirt with you, though I gotta say fellas that maybe the best part of this presentation for Alone in the Dark is that it doesn't take place in the 20s, so I don't have to listen to swing music or oh man, I don't even want to think about it, but if I had to deal with electro swing, it would have been a nasty ordeal. Now comes the part that I was the most interested in with Alone in the Dark, and that is of course the narrative, and how Pieces Interactive finds a way to adapt this ye old horror game and its pulpy sort of setting for modern audiences. I'm going to split this section into two chunks, one concerning with all the characters in a more pulpy sort of way, and then the relations that this game has to the original Alone in the Dark and its narrative and influences. To start, you would not be insane in noticing that the characters and how they act are rather strange throughout the adventure. There's times when some of the characters look like they're hamming it up with their Southern Gothic talk, and other times when they're just doing weird stuff. But then on the other hand, you have the main characters who play it pretty straight and are more like the average man jumping feet first into the 15th season of whatever Chthonian nightmare scenario that they've gotten themselves into. I do believe this split was done purposefully, not just to have an avenue for the protagonist to be a proxy for the player, but to also become more and more familiar as the game goes along, to where Carnby and Emily will become more in tune with the other characters. Another aspect of it that I personally see is that the way the characters act is like something out of a pulp novel, or hell, if I can be a little bit pretentious, something out of like a Lynch movie, with the sort of just weird and bizarre interactions that you'll come across. Hell, there's even a point where you meet up with our local floozy Ruth Tallant, and she gives you a little chat about what's going on, only to start doing a little dance to some piano music, as if it was Audrey from Twin Peaks going into a trance and moving to the music. Though if I had to make a more definitive stance, then I would say it's probably because the game is going for that pulp novel feel that is not necessarily raunchy, but supposed to be something that you might take a little tongue-in-cheek. For instance, a lot of the old pulp novellas of old, from the likes of H.P. Lovecraft or Argus Derleth, were always published with some more raunchy tales of science fiction or horror, with a lot of characters feeling like they came from some nasty B-movie. These characters certainly feel like they came from this sort of literature, and doing so, I really enjoyed the characters in that aspect. Because with a lot of these old stories, it's like a fine old aperitivo. You gotta enjoy it with some cheese. Now, the other part of the narrative that I want to talk about is how Alone in the Dark has a lot of connections with the Cthulhu mythos, and how some things have stayed the same and how some things have changed from the original 1992 release. For the most part, I would say that there are some sizable changes from the original game, and that while the initial premise and most of the central players are the same, there are also a lot of addition and changes, and some of which have to deal with the villains. One such example is that Jeremy Hartwood is missing in the remake, while in the original he committed suicide under strange circumstances. Another is the inclusion of Grace Saunders, which is the little girl running around, was completely missing in the original Alone in the Dark, but is a major character in Alone in the Dark 2, where she is kidnapped by a band of monsters. Another alteration is that the main antagonist that was found in the OG game, Ezekiel Pregst, is nowhere to be seen apart from a cheeky nod, and has been relatively replaced by the Darkman, who is a manifestation of something truly heinous. Now, typically people might be upset that the remake has what some would consider unnecessary changes, but the narrative changes and alterations found in Alone in the Dark are minor ones that I can see are being set up for future titles, especially when it comes to the Lovecraftian influences that may or may not be resolved at the end of the game. Ultimately, I really enjoyed the narrative of Alone in the Dark. It did an excellent job of juggling being a fun, pulpy horror story without taking itself too seriously, while at the same time being a worthy adaptation of a storied franchise and setting up future stories to be told with Carnby and Emily at the helm. So fellas, it looks like I had a great time with this game. Though, I gotta be real, there is one sad critical flaw with this game, and that is of course the price. Now, I want to be incredibly clear in saying that I never want to tell the developer what the value of their own work should be, but I have to be real in saying that for the vast majority of us out there, there's a price that people are willing to pay for AA experiences, and sadly, it seems that $60 or €60 price point is not it. In the period that we are in, there is no shortage of backlogged survival horror titles out there in a vein similar to Alone in the Dark, but done typically on a AAA budget. Such examples within the last year are the wonderful Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space remakes, which at this point can be found for about €20 or $20 each. And while I understand what Pieces Interactive needs to get their money back, the sad reality is that most players just kinda don't care. Which honestly is just a genuine shame, because I've seen interviews with the developers over at Pieces Interactive with the original director for the 1992 game, and it's very clear that they are passionate about the project and aren't doing it for a quick buck. And if people just gave the game a chance and understood that this is a limited AA effort, people honestly might really enjoy its odd, pulpy charm. So, nearing end here, you're probably wondering to yourself and asking, well, Tom, do you recommend this game or not? And the answer is absolutely. If you're looking for a survival horror game that's set in the American Gothic setting of 1930s Louisiana, that's a little tongue-in-cheek but ultimately delivers on an interesting, pulpy, and weird experience, then I would handedly recommend that you enjoy Alone in the Dark 2024, or just Alone in the Dark. You can grab Alone in the Dark on pretty much most platforms, and at the moment it is about $60 or €60. The price might be a bit high now, but when it gets down on price and you see it for a nice discount like $20 or $30, then it would be an easy buy for me, especially if you like survival horror and Lovecraftian settings. And I will be honest in saying that recommendation also comes after hearing that the game was underperforming and that some of the staff at Pieces Interactive have been laid off. Knowing that I enjoyed the game a good deal, it's only natural that I hope that people buy it in order to hopefully get a sequel and perhaps see what Pieces Interactive can do with more experience and perhaps even maybe a higher budget. I know it might not be anything substantial for you fellas out there, but if any of you who work at Pieces Interactive or that got laid off are watching this, then I hope the best for you guys, and honestly, hopefully everything and everyone will be back on their feet soon. Well, fellows, that was Alone in the Dark, developed by Pieces Interactive, and I have to say that I really enjoyed that game. It's honestly not very often these days that I go and play and finish a game and go, damn, hell, that was pretty damn good, and go through it all over again from the beginning with a new character. Last time I did that, I think it was honestly with Resident Evil 2 Remake. And man, fellas, it is nice to see this game finally get out of the muck of some honestly terrible games. Like hell, there was Alone in the Dark Illumination, which was just a terrible PvE experience. You went up against Cthulhu at the end. And then of course there's Alone in the Dark 2008, which is just a shit show. But man, finally we got some new games out there. Maybe for Alone in the Dark 2008, maybe I might take a look at it one day, because honestly it's kind of a weird game, and it's got some really weird dialogue in it. But with that, fellas, thank you so much for getting to this part of the video. If you made it all the way to the end here, then thank you so much. It really does mean a whole lot to me, every single one of you guys that make it to the end of this video. For everybody returning and enjoying the content, I love you guys. You guys make it worth it. And for all the new people out there that are watching this show for the first time, well then, hey, welcome to the Tomthechosen1 channel. I hope you really enjoyed this video, and maybe I might suggest go look at my other content, and if you really enjoy that content, then maybe you should subscribe. That would be really cool. But of course, fellas, this is Tomthechosen1 hiding here out in the Louisiana swamp, and I'm running away from the Shrekist and maybe some big mosquitoes, because goddamn, these skeeters are making me sick. So with that, I'm gonna leave you guys out there. So this is Tomthechosen1, and I hope you guys take it easy.